Hello, and welcome to Message in the Middle with Marianne. We all know that life is hard, right? It's messy, it's unpredictable, but it can be wonderful all at the same time. My hope is that we can take a deep dive into self-development topics and explore life's lessons through book clubs, conversations, and interviews. And together, we can uncover the lessons that others have already learned to help us navigate this crazy, wonderful ride called life. Hello and welcome to Message in the Middle with Marianne, and today with my guest, Melissa Chureau. Melissa is a lawyer, a purpose and mindset coach, a mindfulness teacher, and a podcaster. Melissa uses deep inquiry, mindfulness, and principles of somatics to help people move beyond imposterism and perfectionism and to help them uncover their true, whole, and integrated selves. So thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. We've tried to do this a few times, but finally, our schedules aligned.
Yay, the stars aligned, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
For those listening, Melissa and I met through a podcasting community that we're in and decided that since we had some crossover in our topics, we would get together and have a discussion and hopefully bring you guys some insight. That's a tall tale, but we'll see.
Yeah, we've got a high bar, but I think we can get there.
So the way I like to typically kick off is to ask people to sort of give their backstory. And you've had a little bit of a journey in the last 25 years. And I didn't do your longer bio because I wanted to leave you some of that to sort of give you a story and how you got to really start practicing more in this world. So would you mind sharing some of that with us?
Sure, I would love to. Well, in the beginning, I was born. No, I'm just kidding. I won't start there.
Wait, just for those that can't see us, that is a little bit more than 25 years, but just a little.
Just a little, maybe double. No, I mean, yeah, my story, I guess, it's hard to say where exactly it begins. I grew up as a kiddo in the late 70s and the 80s with ADHD. And yet they didn't call it that back then. They called it minimal brain dysfunction, which is even worse. I don't even like the word disorder because I don't think it's a disorder. I think it's just a different way of thinking that we're sort of forced into trying to acclimate to the rest of culture to fit in. Anyway, I had ADHD, and what I learned from a really, really young age was not to ask for help, to mask the problem, and just pretend like everything was normal. And that creates a lot of internal conflict and a lot of different and apartness sorts of feelings, which I then later managed during my late middle school and high school years with alcohol and partying and being really a different person. I was definitely a rebel and just wanted to be different. And I thought that everybody's, at least what I saw on people's outsides, I could never be that. I was comparing my insides with their outsides. And I thought if people knew who I really, really was, they definitely wouldn't like me. They wouldn't accept me. They would reject me. And so I became a chameleon of sorts and really lost touch with who I was. And again, managed my feelings with alcohol, which led to totally disastrous and awful and crazy results. In the 12-step community of which I'm a part now, we can laugh at that because we identify it as just like some of the most ridiculous things that we thought and we did. And it's sort of like the people who survive the Titanic that can kind of laugh like, oh my gosh, we made it through. It's that laughter. It's that kind of like uneasy laughter, really. But yeah, so I managed my ADD and with alcohol and my difference and my everythingness, and then, kept trying to live life and went on to college. I ended up going, I was just talking with a good friend of mine from high school and later years. And I was saying, I never thought, and this goes to the imposterism that we might get to, I never thought that I was smart. I never thought that I had anything to offer. And even though people would tell me that from time to time or encourage me from time to time, I just didn't believe them. I thought if they really, really, really knew, there's no way they would ever think that. And so when I was going to a community college, and I had a professor there of English, and she was brilliant, and she wanted me to apply to Berkeley. And I thought, what? Like, I'm never going to get into there. So I had applied to a state school in California, and totally fine, respectable school. Although my friend who I was talking to recently, she's like, we all got into that school, Melissa. They took anyone. I'll keep it nameless, but they were a fine institution. But this professor encouraged me to apply to Berkeley, and I thought, what the hell? And so I did, and I could not believe when they allowed me in. And so this kept happening to me throughout my time at Berkeley and throughout later time. I ended up going to law school. I mean, I just had this sense that this was all wrong, that I was definitely an imposter. And there was no way that anyone could think otherwise if they really, really knew who I was. And this caused all sorts of trouble. Again, I continued to manage a lot of my feelings, my ADD with alcohol. And at some point that had to end. And I kind of crossed a tipping point. I had been sober, I should back up a little bit in my younger years. And thank God for that, right? Because I had this idea that there was this community out there. And even in that community, I felt like an imposter. Like I wasn't a real alcoholic, like somehow my drinking wasn't as bad as everybody else's. And if they knew, I just somehow, they talk about being honest with ourselves in order to recover. And I thought, well, gosh, maybe I'm just this like pathological liar or something like that. I don't know. I mean, I just doubted myself constantly. And I think it's comical that I doubted myself even in a 12-step community, right? Where everybody is accepted, everybody. So anyway, I ended up going to law school, and I went to law school because I didn't think I was smart enough to go to, it's so funny, and it doesn't make any sense because of course you have to be smart to go to law school. But I was terrified of taking the GREs to get into a master's program. I wanted to be a teacher or maybe make documentaries. I wasn't really sure, but it was something more, I guess, traditionally creative, I guess, is what I was interested in doing. And I had my undergraduate degree was in English literature. I wrote poetry. I performed poetry. I did all that stuff. So it was a really odd choice that I decided to go to law school. Other than the fact that I watched a whole lot of Special Victims Unit on TV, and I was like, that's badass. Like, that's really cool. These people are awesome and they're helping people. And so I kind of had this construct in my head that I would be some savior of the environment. I have no lawyers in my family, no lawyers, nobody beyond my mother is an RN. Other than that, there's nobody in my family who had done anything up to that point that was professionally, higher education in that way, other than my mother being an RN, which is huge. But I just was like, I had no idea of what it would be like to be in law school. I just thought, well, I can take the test, which doesn't require you to have any knowledge, unlike the GREs, which requires you to know math and things like that. So that's how I thought, I'll do that. And it's a stable job, right? And I was like, probably if I become an English teacher or God forbid, I make documentaries, I'm definitely going to be as poor as I was when I grew up. So this, at least, it kind of logically made sense.
Yeah.
And and I'm a good lawyer. I eventually, during law school, got sober again and have been sober since then. So that's been almost 23 years. And, thank God for that. Saved my life. Honestly, saved my life. But it was many years into sobriety, and I still couldn't face up to my ADD. I still couldn't, especially in the law, and maybe we'll get into this a little bit. You really can't admit having any sort of so-called weaknesses. And I was viewing my ADD as a weakness. And that if anyone found out about this, my employer, other lawyers, that this would just somehow be exploited and used against me. That every mistake I made would either be attributed to my ADD, or if I ever told anyone about my recovery from alcoholism, it would be attributed to that. So I was terrified. And so I hid.
It really reinforces how strong the voices within our own heads and how our own self-image can keep us captive because you're not quite there in your story, but you obviously go on to prove that that's all BS and that you were enough and that those things that either were a medical condition, if you will, and or something you went through in your younger years have absolutely no impact on, I mean, they have an impact on who you are, but you know what I mean? The job you can do every day as a lawyer, you know how to do it. You've mastered that condition and you've worked around that ability with different tools. I'm sure we'll talk about some of them, but just like anybody else does, like if you have a poor memory, maybe you write lists, whatever. Each of us has deficits. I'm going to say a deficit. I probably shouldn't label it like that, but I think you know my point. You learn how to accommodate our own weaknesses. We all have them, but yet those voices in your head just told you from, gosh, so young that these things would hold you back and that you weren't enough and you believed it.
Yeah, no, it absolutely did hold me back. And, you know, it's funny because even though, I mean, and this was all true, even though I was heavily steeped in 12-step recovery work, I was very involved in meditation. I was in therapy. I read every self-help book known to man. And yeah,
you did all the things.
I did all of the things. And it really wasn't until the shit hit the fan with me, I think, 17, 18, 19 years. Well, actually, it was before that. I had some bumps in the road with my marriage because I was keeping everything separate. I didn't think my husband wanted to know about my recovery. I didn't want to bother him. I didn't want to be the broken one. And yet he was feeling like I wasn't sharing some of the most intimate parts of myself. So thank God we were able to work through that together. And that was huge. This kind of, I'm calling it like a path toward integration. So that was my first step on the road toward integration, integrating all of me with all that I do and all that I love. And so that was the first step, was my marriage. Like, this is who I am. I'm going to share that with you. I'm going to be vulnerable with you. And in that vulnerability, surprise, surprise, I mean, Brene Brown's been saying it all along. That's where connection happens.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until I was willing to take that risk, and it was fucking terrifying, even with my own husband. And I had already been married for 15 years at that point. We got married in 1995. And so even in that really safe place with a very loving husband, I was terrified to be who I really am.
Well, you were wearing a lot of masks for a lot of years.
Yes.
It's really hard to take them off.
It is. It's terrifying. But it was also, I remember the first time I took off one of the masks with my husband, and he was so beautifully understanding and present with me. And it was, it's, I don't know why I thought he would be anything other than that. He's never indicated that he would be anything other than that, but that fear is irrational, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so he provided that first safe place for me to be who I am. And it was huge. And we became, much, much closer. And, it also proved to me I had at least one safe place, right?
Yes. And that the stories you had been telling yourself weren't true.
Right. Yeah. And so, that was one road on the path to integration. And then it was later when shit hit the fan at work for me. And I realized I have got to tell these people I have ADD. And I have got to work through this so that they understand that what they're seeing as a problem is not a problem that can't be worked through. Right? There is a solution to this. And so I unmasked there. And again, that was terrifying. And I'm in 12-step and I have a community, I have a support system. I had all of that, and it was still terrifying. And I remember, I have a certain amount of spirituality. I don't know exactly what I believe in, but it's some power greater than myself. And I remember asking my higher power to come with me into the room when I talked with my work about my ADD. And I didn't feel alone anymore. And I walked into that room and I was able to be exactly who I am. And they were perfectly understanding. And we found a solution. And again, another many, many bricks in the pathway toward integration. And what really worked is eventually I decided to just kind of come out, and I don't know what it was. There wasn't any one moment that it was like, oh, this is the moment. It just was like, it was a fuck it moment. Like, I don't care anymore. And maybe that's age. Maybe that's all the work that I had done, but all the years of meditation and therapy and self-help and unmasking. But I realized that if I really wanted to help anyone, including myself, but if I really wanted to have an impact on anyone else who might have experienced what I had experienced, I need to come out, as it were, right? Like, I needed to tell people this was the only way I was going to destigmatize this thing. And it turns out I was right. I just started to be open about my recovery. Now, I recognize that I had a lot of luxury. By the time I was out in my recovery, I had 19, 20 years of sobriety under my belt. So, it's pretty solid stuff.
It's still hard, though. Don't minimize that,
Yeah.
right? Because, it's still hard whenever you do tell the story and you are that raw and show up in that vulnerable way. I don't care if it's 50 years later. It's still hard.
It is. And I think it was maybe even harder to come out about my ADD for all the reasons I was talking about before for my profession. And I again thought that the only way that I'm going to destigmatize this, and I know I'm not the only one here. I remember going to a continuing legal education workshop on lawyers with ADD, and there was this whole room of us, and I was like, okay, right? Like,
this is a thing.
This is a thing. And they were people I liked. Like, there were people that actually I had no idea I had. They worked. So one or two people worked in my very office that I had just didn't know, and then there were other lawyers that I sort of knew from the community, and others that I was meeting, and I was like, oh, this is a thing. Like. And these are actually the people that I like, because they're the quirky, funny, interesting, people. And I was like, oh, okay. And then in I think it was 2018, the American Bar Association. So they're not really the governing body for lawyers, but they're a body of lawyers and very influential in the community. And they come up with the model rules of ethics and things like that. And they came out with a huge report about mental health and lawyers, and how many lawyers are suffering from mental health and substance use disorders. And one of their main pillars was, we have to destigmatize these quote unquote conditions that people are experiencing in order for people to get help. That so many lawyers, which by the way is the highest profession among all professions for mental health and substance use disorder in this country.
That makes sense to me, because it's A, very stressful, but B, very social.
Right.
Right. So you think of those two things that typically drive people to, I don't know, drink or do drugs or do whatever that you need to do to cope.
Yeah. And it's the fascinating statistic is for, I think, alcohol use. What they compared was other professions, so other high stress professions. And the closest, I think, were physicians. And they just sort of grouped, all physicians. They didn't break them out into type. And lawyers were still much higher than physicians. But then when they further broke it out between women and men lawyers, female lawyers had twice the incidence of alcohol abuse as male lawyers. And that got me thinking about why that could be. And it's like, well, because it's still, at least in this country, a predominantly older white male profession. And or those are the traditions that we live in. And women feel as though they have to fit into that. And so many probably manage with alcohol or other substance use or suffer from anxiety. And I'm not saying that men don't. Obviously, they do. We have the highest incidence of this in the country.
Don't you think that also from a women perspective, again, we're generalizing, but women generally take on more of the household and family and children. And so you're potentially balancing all of that, plus a really big career that's very full of pressure and, judgment and all of that. So it's probably more a combination too.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, there have been some studies around female lawyers in the workplace, and they also take on those roles in the workplace. I mean, not all, but many do. So they're the ones who bring the coffee to the meeting or the donuts or whatever, and or make arrangements or make sure people feel, okay. Again, not always. And then you have the other women who are sort of taking on that more traditional white male role and the pressure that causes. It's extraordinary. And, to kind of come back to that imposterism too, I think it was something like 70% of all people have experienced some level of imposterism. And among lawyers, it's really high, especially female lawyers, especially BIPOC female lawyers, because you now have this cultural pressure or the societal pressure to achieve and be perfect and to be able to do it all. And in the case of BIPOC or other underrepresented persons, there's this idea that they have to be like the person that epitomizes their culture or their background. And so God forbid they ever screw up. So they have this incredible amount of perfectionism. And then they walk into a room where nobody looks like them, right? And so of course they feel like an imposter. And then the culture of law, by and large, it's changing. But it has this sort of it's steeped in systemic imposterism. In other words, because of the way law firms and law organizations operate, it feeds into imposterism, even if they don't intend to, right? Like, I'm not saying that people are mean or, they're malicious or whatever. This is just the tradition. And I'm sure it's the case with other professions. And so what do people do? They mask, they, self-medicate, mm-hmm. They drop out of the field altogether. They do all of these things. And so the ABA came out and said, well, in order to destigmatize these things, we've got to start talking with them. And the best way to do that is to talk with people who have experienced it. So that was when I was like, okay, yeah, I have to start talking about this. And not just for lawyers, all people who experience imposterism. I spoke with someone yesterday who's a physician, and despite his incredible, and I've talked to many physicians, incredible successes, and they're so smart, and they got through goddamn medical school. I can't even imagine. And many of them feel like imposters, right? Because there's always someone smarter. There's always somebody who's better, or at least it seems that way.
Yeah. I interviewed somebody that published the podcast last week, and she works with what we would consider celebrities, stars, people that are in high profile places. And I asked her for what the one most shocking thing was after, working and coaching with all those people. And it boils down to they don't feel like they're enough. And it's the same. I just, there's this thought that we're all kind of just the same. And I think we are. We all kind of suffer from these same things, especially women, which is sort of the focus group that I'm working with always is around women. And we just seem to have these common things that can hold us back, but also these common revelations where we start unlearning things like usually around our 50s, and we start unlearning and masking and really taking ourselves to the next level. And it's just such a freeing time once we get into that space. But it's so interesting how much in common people have.
It really is. And when we can connect on that basis, I mean, that's where the magic happens, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's where we really connect, is when we all unmask and we say, oh, this is what I was sort of thinking. And we kind of have a chuckle and we go, yeah, me too.
Yeah. And learn from each other, right? That was one of the premises of what I was trying to do, is just curate information for people, because if somebody else knows all the answers, why not take advantage of the experience or the mess they've already gone through, right? I mean, we don't all have to go through the same mess. Let's lean on each other and learn some lessons from each other.
Right. 100%. Yeah. And I love, what you do in your book club and all the books. And I mean, I think we joked about this offline another time, but I mean, I have literally stacks of books that are hidden. I've hidden them underneath but they're not really hidden. My husband knows they're there. They're the books that, that's next on the list. And then that,
yeah,
because I truly believe we can learn from one another. And like you said, why go down the same road if somebody's already been down that road? I can learn.
The key is learning to put it into action, right? We can read as many books and we can talk to as many coaches and we can join as many communities as we want, but it's going to get us to zero places and zero change if we don't put it into action. So I always like to add that on top because people need to always have that at the forefront of their thought that they can do as much research as they want, but you could research yourself to death. You have to start taking some type of action towards whatever it is you're looking to do.
100%. And I think that action, I mean, I get intimidated sometimes by that word, like, oh God, it's another thing I have to do. Oh God. And I didn't check off that box on that list. And what does that mean? That means I'm a terrible person. I can't even do this, blah, blah, blah. So in the last little bit, I've been looking at these things more as like, what experiment am I going to do today?
Yes.
I'm just going to do a little bit of an experiment. And if I didn't get to the experiment that I was hoping to, that's okay. I can learn from that, or, there's probably some takeaway for why I chose not to do that experiment. But somehow using the word experiment and thinking about it and reframing it that way has really helped me take away the sting of it being an action item or something more I have to do.
I like that. I like that a lot. And I like to say, look at things with curiosity and give yourself grace, right? So I think both of those fit in with what you're saying. Make it less about a tactical plan, but more about what can I learn out of this? What if I try this?
And then treating ourselves, I mean, I'm still learning on this one, but treating ourselves like we would a friend.
Yes.
In other words, if my friend, like, let's say, you told me you wanted to try some new thing for self-improvement or self-development. And I was like, that's awesome, Marianne. Cool. And then you told me the next day, oh God, Melissa, I didn't do it. I would not say to you, God damn it, Marianne, what the hell is wrong with you? When are you going to get this right? You can't even do that. But those are the words that usually come to my mind.
Yeah.
And so I have learned from various wonderful teachers, Kristen Neff, Tara Brach, all these beautiful people out there in the world, and then from engaging in experiments that often feel kind of silly. Okay, I'll put my hand on my heart and I will say, thank you, Melissa, for those interesting thoughts. I know you're just trying to keep me safe from failure, but I've got this one.
Yeah. It works though. Those sort of weird things, they work. Those tactics work because they make you snap out of that go-to reactionary default thing that we know that we've done for 100 years. Well, maybe not 100, but and it makes us look at things in a different perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and, I've also experienced, and I wish people didn't have to go to 12-step in order to experience the kind of community that we in 12-step get to experience. And I think there are probably other groups as well. But, when I go to a 12-step meeting and somebody shares something really vulnerable, nobody comments on it. We're all holding space for the person. And if anything, after the meeting, we come up and say, oh my God, thank you so much for sharing. I felt the same way. And so what is that but teaching ourselves how to talk to ourselves in that same way, how to hold space for ourselves and how to treat ourselves with love and give some grace.
Yeah.
I love that you give yourself some grace because that's huge.
Yeah. You have to.
Yeah.
You have to. Talk to me a little bit about this whole mindfulness journey. So you've dabbled in that space for 25 years between meditation and some of the certifications and whatnot you've done. But you're really, really digging deep into it now. And I think exemplify it as a way of life. Yeah. So let me ask you first, what does being mindful mean to you? So let's get your thoughts on that. And then I have a couple follow-up questions.
Yeah, I have been steeped in mindfulness for 25 years. And the funny part of that story is, and then I'll answer your question, is way back when I first got involved with 12-step, it was down in the Bay Area in Marin County. And the person who I was working with on 12-step work was like, oh, have you, tried meditation? And it's one of the steps, right? So I was like, well, I don't know. And I really doubted that my ADD busy mind could do that. And so I was like, well, I'll give it a shot. And they said, well, I'll take you out to this place called Spirit Rock Meditation Center. I was like, okay, whatever. And I went out to this place, and a guy by the name of Jack Cornfield was speaking and leading a meditation. And some of your listeners may know who he is. Like, I had no idea that this guy was like a leader in Western mindfulness practices. And here I was, oh yeah, fine, I'll check out this old hippie guy who went to India. And, he was awesome. He used to give these Monday night talks that, you would do 40 minutes of sitting meditation.
That's long.
40 minutes.
That's long.
It's really long.
For starters, that's long. Like
anyone.
Well, maybe. I want to talk about that busy mind, but yeah, go ahead.
And I would sit there and I would do it and, focusing on the breath in and out, and then my brain would go crazy. And I would think, I wonder if anyone else is thinking this. And then of course, when somebody was snoring and I was like, well, there's that guy, or like, whatever. I mean, it seemed like when I shut my eyes and I got quiet, it got louder. And I was like, what the fuck? Is this the way this is supposed to go? And, and then you learn by experience, like things come and go, they arise, they leave, they do all the things. And what I learned there and over time in my practice, because some kind of magic happened there. I don't know what it was, but some kind of magic happened there. There was like maybe 1 second where everything made sense. One moment of like, I had this grand kind of spacious feeling inside of my head, inside of my body. And I was like, oh, I want that. And what it also gave me was a whole lot of acceptance for myself, because what I learned was that my thoughts came and went. They just came and went, unless I grabbed onto them. If I jumped on them like a horse, they were off. I was off on some crazy thing. But I had the power of choice to bring the horse back to the stable. And that was amazing too. Like, that was transformative for me, was to realize this whole thing was not about having no thought, but actually just being present for what is.
I want to stop there for a second, because I think that's so huge. So we listened to, read the books of Dr. Amy Johnson, and all her works around thoughts come and go. They're not fact, they're just thoughts. And I think tying that to using meditation to reinforce that, to not get so focused on having to be quiet or not have any thoughts, but to just learn to accept that they can come and go. And having that reinforce the knowledge that it is just a thought, I actually think that's really big. That's a big epiphany. I don't know that, everybody would put that together.
Yeah, it definitely was a huge epiphany for me. And, even one that I will regularly have again and again. In other words, like, there still will be times where I go down the rabbit hole with my thoughts and then get judgmental. Oh, you can't even meditate, Melissa. And then I laugh, right? Because I'm like, oh, right. And I learned how to name the thing, judgment, self-judgment. And by naming the thing, it would dissipate eventually. And I mean, like all things do, they come and they go. My thoughts, my feelings, all of it came and went as predictably as water flows down a river. It just came and went. And once I had that epiphany, everything sort of lined up and changed. And it was like, okay, if I can remember the things that happen in meditation also happen in real life, then I'm onto something. Then I don't need to get so attached to outcomes or feelings or expectations. And it's not that I don't have feelings. I do. It's just that there's a little bit more perspective and there's more spaciousness around it. And I don't take myself so seriously most of the time. I mean, you'd have to ask my husband. He might disagree a little bit, but I think he would agree that it's much less than it used to be. That I just have a groundedness and a centeredness and not as much reactivity as I used to have. And that's freaking huge for anyone, but especially somebody who has a busy, busy mind. And that's what I tell people. Like, people are like, I can't meditate. I have too many thoughts. And I was like, well, look, I have ADHD. If I can meditate, you can meditate. It may not be what you think of meditation. And there's also no requirement that you sit. Like, everyone's like, oh, you have to sit on a special cushion, cross-legged, with some kind of mudra, your hands held in a certain way. And yes, that is one way to meditate, and you certainly can do it. But there are other ways of meditating. And I think my first one of my first meditations, other than the ones with Jack Kornfield, and I didn't even recognize them as meditations, was running. I would run and I would just be totally present. I would listen to my breath going in and out, seeing trees, watching the wind, being present and not at all in my thoughts. And that was actually what made running kind of addictive for a little while, especially when I was in early recovery, because it was like I had this spaciousness. It's not that the thoughts didn't happen, they just happened less frequently. And I wasn't attached to them, they would go. And so running can be a form of meditation. Walking, eating, doing anything, showering. It's just what attention you're bringing in the moment. Sort of this not detached, but you have more space and perspective between you and what is happening. And you can really watch with wonder sometimes at what is happening. And that sounds a little goofy, but it can be really helpful. I talked to a guy yesterday, Dr. Michael Amster, and he wrote a book with his colleague, Jake Eagle, about the power of awe. And they're talking about a different sort of meditation. And I love it. It's just like, it's tapping into the emotion of awe. And it could be 30 seconds looking at something very ordinary, but really, really being present for whatever it is that you're witnessing. And certainly we've all experienced awe out in nature. And so that's another way to be mindful and to be present. And what I found, and the neuroscience is there, is it changes the way we think. It also changes our physical condition. Regular mindfulness has been shown to improve heart conditions, to improve your nervous system, to decrease pain, to decrease anxiety, decrease depression. It has an impact on all of these mental and physical abilities and conditions. And I just think it takes very little. And we're in this world that's freaking crazy and just moving at the speed of light with everything coming at us. That to allow ourselves 5-10 minutes or even a moment of being present, it just can alter the way that we feel and the way that we experience all of that craziness, and gives us a little bit more perspective and spaciousness around that.
What advice would you give to somebody that's just trying to start? Like if somebody, I actually know a couple people in my group that are saying, I really want to start meditating and I really want to start finding that time and space for that presence and self-inflection, or self-reflection, but not really sure where to start. What are your thoughts on that? What tips would you give there?
Yeah, there's so much that people can do. And I think even just having the intention is huge. That is like halfway there, right? But a really simple practice is just sitting for, maybe give yourself a minute, maybe two, maybe closing the eyes, maybe not. And just noticing the breath as it comes in and out, in and out. And it's just like a gentle wave that you don't have to do anything special. You don't have to burn any incense. You don't have to be on a pillow. You don't have to do anything. And just noticing that. And what people will notice is their thoughts coming and going. And just letting that be. And just trying that for like a minute or two. And then maybe after a couple of days of a minute or two, maybe try 3 minutes of that. There are all sorts of apps out there that can be really helpful. The Calm app is one of my favorites. 10% Happier, also one of my favorites. But Insight Timer is a free app, so there's no pay. I do some meditations on my podcast, Fully Mindful. Those are free. I think people should definitely, especially if they're really new at it, check out The Power of Awe, thepowerofawe.com. There are literally like 30-second practices that you can do.
I love that tip. And I love people should think about listening or dialing into one of these, because I do think that when you're trying to get started, having a more of a guided experience, I've definitely, listened to some of yours, and it's just such a soothing, I don't know, they're like 10, 12 minutes. And it's just such a great way to like let you take me to that place of calm and clear and spaciousness that I can't necessarily get to on my own yet. So I do think that people can check that out. I think your resource would be great, or any of those. But I find a guided situation to be easier. Maybe not for everybody, but I did for myself. I found that easier.
Yeah, I think so too. And certainly if you can find a community of any sort, that is really helpful, because having the place, like when I went to Spirit Rock, I mean, there's no way I could have sat for 40 minutes on my own. I don't think I could have sat for 4 minutes on my own, maybe 40 seconds. That's about it. But having a group of people doing this together was huge. And it's not about being alone. It's actually about communing with something that is bigger than ourselves, whether that's nature, the universe, God, whatever you think it might be. None of the above. Just the experience of being human and being connected is really huge. So if you can find a community, and there are online communities as well, so you don't have to, necessarily have something in your town. There are online communities where you can experience that. Both, I think, Tara Brach and Kristen Neff have online meditation communities. Sanghas, Spirit Rock, a meditation center does. I hope to someday soon have one that people can check out. So stay tuned. Or, and people can try this with their kids. Such a wonderful thing to introduce to children. And children already are far more present. Although if they're younger children, you may only want to do it for like a minute, right?
Yeah.
You can notice like one of my favorite meditations is a mindful eating practice where, and you don't have to go through the whole thing. There's a huge way of doing this whole mindfulness practice with a raisin, but you can get a raisin with a kid and have them really look at the raisin and look at all the wrinkles and feel the raisin and maybe think about where the raisin might have come from, maybe smell the raisin, listen to the raisin for a second. Does it make any noise at all? And plop it in the mouth, but then don't eat it. Just swirl it around. And what does that feel like? And what happens, right? And just noticing what happens with our bodies and our minds in that moment, and chewing, and how incredible of an experience that is. And it's really fun. And it's fun to do with, like I said, a kid. Even a teenager might try to do it. They might privilege you with their presence for a moment, or just taking a walk, is another nice way. Just being really present, feeling your foot hit the ground, watching the trees or the leaves or the wind or the cars or whatever is happening, and just being present and sharing that with a loved one while you're taking a walk together. Oh, I see, that tree over there. You see that tree rustling. Oh, do you see that bluebird? What do you think it's doing? Those are mindful moments too.
I love all that. And the more that I think about it, the more I talk to people about it. Being present is something that many of us struggle with and are working towards doing a better job with. And really just coming off that autopilot on everything and just really dialing it in so that everything is intentional. Mm-hmm. And as I hear you talk about this, whether it be the raisin or the mindful walk, it really does help you dial it into that, because you are forcing yourself to take notice of everything related to that thing you're doing. Mm-hmm. And that truly is the essence of being present, right? It's really all about noticing the detail, really taking it all in, and not just popping it in your mouth and eating it if it's the raisin or whatever. So what a great example. What a great example.
Well, and it's really an incredible experience, right? The more present we are, the more wonder we can have in our lives. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, do we really have enough wonder in our lives? Probably not. But really, the very everyday things that we do are pretty miraculous. We just, like you said, we're on autopilot most of the time. So what if we engage in some of these practices so that we can be more present for ourselves and for our loved ones and for the world?
Yeah, that's where the magic is. Mm-hmm. That's where the magic is.
Yeah.
Well, listen, this has been fantastic. Yes. And thank you for sharing your story and some of this mindfulness with us. I hope it makes people think a little bit more and figure out how they can bring more of it into their life. Is there anything we didn't touch on that you'd like to leave the audience with?
One of the things that I think is a wonderful practice too is, we tend to think of mindfulness, of course, we think of the mind, but I'd like to invite people to consider that it's also the rest of their body. It's the mind body. And so it's okay. And in fact, I would encourage people to notice what's happening in their body. Our bodies are really wise, and we often forget them, and we float around in this beautiful mind of our own, but it's all connected. And so I guess I would just invite people to expand whatever practice they have to include the rest of their body.
And we do often shush our body when it's given us signals and we don't want to pay attention to the whispers. So that's a really great reminder. If you had to call out one place that people can find you or get to you the easiest, what would that be?
The best place to find me is on my website, thefullymindful.com. There's connections to LinkedIn and to all of the podcasts that I do, an email you can send. And I'm always happy to hear from anyone on any questions. Really happy to hear from folks.
Awesome. Thank you so much again for talking with me today.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Message in the Middle with Marianne. If you enjoyed the podcast, please take a minute to share it and write a review, as it helps bring new listeners to our audience. If you'd like to keep the conversation going between episodes, please join us at Facebook group Message in the Middle with Marianne.